We are back and at it again.
Yeah.
It's only
getting ready for this.
It's only been what, like an hour, 2 hours since I talked to you?
Give or take. I know we're like a bad rash. Once you get us, you can't get rid of us.
So I was going to tell you about this earlier, but I forgot, and then we got started, and here we are. I'm kind of going through some of my clothes and like closet and just kind of parsing things out. I need to figure out how and where I got this shirt. Uncle Billy's Uncle Billy's Bummers, War is Hell, and then the back is like a concert tour of all of Sherman's victories through the Atlanta campaign. Amazing. And I gotta be honest with you, I remember that I got this shirt in Georgia, which is hilarious all on its own. But I have no clue where I got it or if people still make it, but I haven't been able to fit in this shirt in like, I don't know, 5 years. But I keep it because it's just so damn cool. It's one of those where like if I could have turned it into like a pillowcase t-shirt or something like that. I don't know, but if one of the many 10 listeners out there knows where that shirt is from,
let us know.
Help a brother out, okay?
That's a dope t-shirt.
Dude, I'm dying for it, man. It's a great shirt. Like between that and my restaurant idea of Uncle Billy's Georgia barbecue, so good it'll make you howl. I mean, come on. What?
We're on to something.
Anyways, we're not here to talk about. Well, we could
barbecue. We're not here to talk about Uncle Billy.
We could, and I feel like our guest could talk about Sherman's March to the Sea to some great extent. Given that our guest is the returning heavyweight champion. No, John McManus is back to join us again. We could talk about Sherman, right, John?
Good. Oh, I'd love to talk about Sherman. So I have a clarifying question. So are all those like the sites, is it all pre-Atlanta or is it March to the Sea, Atlanta to Savannah? I mean, to me, that would be even,
It's Atlanta through to the end. It goes through the Carolinas.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, great.
So,
even like the burn down in Columbia too, I guess. Huh?
Yeah. So we start out Rocky Face Ridge May 7th, and then it ends at Victory at Bennett Place April 26th.
All right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Love it.
War is Hell Victory Tour. That
is very appropriately titled. Yes.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. It's I've never known someone to be like, you know what, today's a good day for war. Yeah. Except for maybe Dick Cheney.
I feel like I need to wear that.
Yeah.
Next time I go down to Atlanta, I'll squeeze into it. It'll be 10-pound sausage, 5-pound case, but I'll get in that shirt just totally for the hell of it.
Absolutely.
So, John, we talked 3 weeks ago?
Something like that.
Almost 3 weeks ago. Mm-hmm. And we had you had you on as part of the Market Garden series. And I know it sounded like I just got choked up. I'm very emotional, but
I know you told yourself you wouldn't cry, Joe. But
yours truly just swallowed the wrong way, and there it is. All right, but we had you on to talk about Market Garden and the American involvement and the American perspective of Market Garden, based largely out of your book, September Hope, an American perspective, an American side on a bridge too far. But at the end of it, we finished by saying, there's so much more we could have talked about, not to mention the Scheldt, which is the piece of the Market Garden story that, by and large, we didn't really even mention throughout many of the other recordings. It sort of falls by the wayside because, like most things Market Garden, it gets kind of caught up in the airborne and the 90% successful, the battle for the bridges, and it is ultimately forgotten. But it is really the Scheldt Estuary in Antwerp is the whole point for any of these operations to begin with. So why do we forget about the Scheldt?
It's not terribly convenient to remember because it's the terrible hangover and aftermath and consequence of Market Garden and its failures. So one of the things about it, so that you'll hear it pronounced two different ways, Scheldt or Scheldt. There are some people in Holland who pronounce it the latter way. Most of us pronounce it the first way. So I'm going to do the first way for our purposes today. I think it's just easier, point of clarification. So the Scheldt Estuary is that sort of 60 miles of waterway and low ground. an inlet and islet that leads from the English Channel into Antwerp. Antwerp being an inland harbor. And the significance of it is you absolutely have to control the Scheldt estuary if you're going to get a use out of Antwerp. And Antwerp is the greatest supply port in Northern Europe. And the Allies are having serious logistical difficulties by September 1944. So they kind of, throw this three sheets to the wind in embracing Market Garden, saying, we think Market Garden will be our Hail Mary pass that will complete and Germany will collapse. And we won't have to worry about all the nuts and bolts of, opening up Antwerp and all this kind of stuff. This is just disastrously mistaken. So I think we don't like to focus on that. And it's one of the reasons why I felt pretty strongly about including a chapter on the Scheldt in my book September Hope, because I think they're linked in the same story. I think sometimes the military authorities of the time kind of will control the later historical narrative by shaping it to their own advantage. And I give you some examples of this. We tend to see the battles of Buna and Guadalcanal as completely different battles. Actually, they're really not. I mean, from a Japanese perspective, they're battles in the same campaign, and that's one of the reasons why they lose. Just we look at it differently because Halsey controls one and MacArthur the other and all that, and then they shape the narrative. In Vietnam, we have tons of instances where we kind of create these operations out of whole cloth and whole names for them, and we create this kind of weird sort of artificial timetable that the other side doesn't really recognize, and we shape the perception of our casualties that way. Well, here too, when Market Garden fails, I mean, the Scheldt just seems to be this random thing that's going on that the Canadians are dealing with the rest of the fall, when in fact they're absolutely linked.
Now, you said something that I'm sure is going to get people fired up when Market Garden failed. So we have to accept that it was in fact an operational failure. And that even if you're 90% successful, you still, like you said, you can't be 90% pregnant. You can't be 90%.
Right. You either are or you aren't. And Market Garden either succeeds or it doesn't. Because why are we doing this? We wanted to capture that bridge over the Rhine and at a minimum, develop a bridgehead over the Rhine. Did we do that? No. So it really didn't matter in that context that we, had Eindhoven or that we controlled for a while the Nijmegen bridges. I mean, because remember, the Germans will attack them and do significant damage to them with their own commando type forces in the aftermath as well. So no, Market Garden is a terrible failure in my opinion. It doesn't really cast any aspersions on the people who fight it. It's not their fault. The valor is off the charts, and the same as it would be in any other any other winning battle or whatever. So it's really not their fault. I don't want to cast any aspersions on them. It's just that for the concept we were hoping and what we were hoping to achieve, we didn't do it. And then in the larger sense, the consequences of this are really quite significant. And I think that we see that we're confronted with that in the Scheldt, in my view.
So this is a combined Allied offensive, correct? And I do find it interesting that the Canadians are sort of spearheading, the Battle of the Scheldt here. And when I think of World War II, I don't immediately think of the Canadians. So I guess
they get left out of everything.
They do, and sort of in this modern day, does that ignorance, so to speak, is that why the Battle of the Scheldt kind of gets, swept under the rug, so to speak?
It's certainly a factor, and I think it's unfortunate because the Canadians are actually in World War II longer than we are. They're in it for the first day. They proportionately really serve and have more people under uniform than we do, and sacrifice more on many levels. And remember, they're fighting a global war too under the umbrella of the British Empire. It's absolutely amazing what Canada contributes to the Allied war effort, especially per capita. So yeah, I think there's always an American tendency to kind of shunt our Canadian friends to the north into this anonymous role, and I think it's a point of great frustration for them, which I totally understand. I absolutely feel their pain. We see it even in relation to D-Day. I think the Canadian 3rd Division's vital role on D-Day and beyond, I think, is we tend to overlook it. And I think you could argue they really fulfill the most initial objectives of any Allied division coming ashore. Well, here in this case, in the fall of 44, Montgomery has two armies under his command. Montgomery is the 21st Army Group commander. He's got the British 2nd Army, and then he's got the Canadian 1st. And he feels that the Canadian First can, do this job of clearing out the Scheldt and capturing it so that we can use Antwerp, even as British Second Army focuses on Market Garden. So it's a terrible miscalculation, because the problem is the Canadian First Army, the per capita really, really good army, is I won't call it hollow, but by American standards, really seriously understrength. They just don't have much manpower, and they're having to absorb a lot of it in besieging the Channel ports. So that's siphoning off combat power too, and this is just too big an ask for the Canadians to do this all by themselves and as quickly as they're going to need to.
And does that go back to just by the time we get to the late summer, early fall of 44, the Allies are just faced with a manpower crisis?
Well, the British and the Canadians certainly are. The Americans, maybe by comparison, are not. Although I would point out that we've mobilized a lot of our population, and a lot of those who are willing to fight have been used by now and are being used again and again and again, especially in ground combat. But we do have the manpower if we need it. That's one piece of good news for us. The problem for us is that we have not utilize it in the manner we will need it, which is ground combat primarily. And so we're very support heavy in terms of the overall macro, global war. The Canadians, on the other hand, I think it's really easy to forget this as Americans. The Canadians are dealing with an incredibly limited pool, because obviously it's not a big country population-wise in the first place, but also the experience of World War I had led Canadian politicians in this era to say, all right, we will compel you to serve to defend the country, but not to serve overseas. So almost all those who are serving overseas, no matter where they are as Canadians, are volunteers. So if I have a Canadian rifle company fighting somewhere in the Scheldt or wherever, I start out with maybe 103, 105 guys, and in ground combat how quickly you're going to chew through those. Am I really going to be able to replace these guys at all? And I think that's really easy to overlook as Americans, where we are getting replacements, not as many as we want, but we do have that. And so that's why I say these are hollow formations, just in that sense of not being able to replace the manpower, not in terms of their proficiency. Per capita, they're really, really good. And they're full of guys with a lot of fight and a significant amount of know-how by now, but there just aren't many of them. And certainly they have a lot of firepower and fire support. But is it enough? Not necessarily for this mission.
I mean, that's, and I was kind of reading up a little bit about the Battle of the Scheldt kind of before we got onto the show.
I would hope.
Yeah, obviously. One could hope. I mean, the thing is, they gave me 2 degrees, but never actually could figure out if I could read or not. I still mix up letters and numbers. I still am of the persuasion that, in 7 days, God did some amazing things to the earth, but so did Satan. And on the 3rd day, Satan put letters in math. I swear. I'm not here to solve for X. Okay. I'm not a pirate. Okay. I'm also not a psychologist. Okay. I'm not here to solve any problems. But what I am trying to figure out is how we get here. But reading up on it, man, this is a bloody knockdown, drag out fight, man. Why? So can you kind of explain, I guess, to our listeners, why is it so bloody?
The terrain is just awful. It's of course, this is really low ground. This is Belgium and Holland, and recovered ground, and high water table, and islets, and of course, just by the way the terrain is, it shouldn't surprise anybody that it tends to be very wet weather. And wet weather usually means it's problematic to attack, to have close air support, to move vehicles and people. The road net isn't particularly good in a lot of these areas. It really hasn't taken the Germans too much to hunker down and fortify some of this, like especially in the dikes and embankments that proliferate through a lot of the area. And of course, I'm generalizing; it's not all like this, but that's the tendency, at least. And so I think that allows them, without using that much manpower, to really to really heavily defend almost any likely route of advance. It doesn't take that much for them. And so when we've had Market Garden, we have kind of taken our eye off the ball in terms of penning in and destroying and cutting off and controlling 15th Army, which is the German formation in the Calais area, which is then going to be redeployed, some of it, into the Scheldt area, and to hunker down and defend. And so any attacker facing defenders is, under challenge at the in modern warfare, especially if they don't have a manpower advantage, which the Canadians don't. And so it pretty much guarantees that it's going to be a slow fight. The other thing too, there's a lot of mines and booby traps, and this is good terrain for that. Certainly the wetness will degrade some of those mines and booby traps, but also in the mud, the crossroads that you've got in many instances. There's a lot of trees that the Germans can cut down and use as roadblocks and whatnot. And of course, you can mine the waters, and that's going to be a serious challenge going forward. Even after we control a lot of the ground, a lot of those waters you guys see are showing on the map there are going to be proliferated with mines, and so that becomes a naval operation that's going to take several weeks too.
And one of the things too about the Scheldt is that it's not just a fight. Oh, well, we're finished with Market Garden. Now we got to turn our attention back to this. This is something that's going on sort of before, in terms of getting the understanding of, all right, we've captured the port, but we have no way to get to the port from out from sea. So we've got to fight to get to a point where we can actually secure a safe avenue for shipping to come in through the Netherlands. So we start out with this whole idea for Market Garden of punching in and making a hole right into Germany, and it'll all be fine and well. And this kind of gets put on almost on the back burner, and it's as though it's happening, but it's not our focus. Mm-hmm. And then it all of a sudden becomes the focus and sucks in troops through the fall. And we're looking at a period in which you don't want to campaign, particularly in Northwest Europe, which is fall heading into winter, because the weather just deteriorates so quickly. Yep. And you've got low-lying ground already flooded anyways. Add to that, now it's just muddy and disgusting and murky and all this other stuff. So we've got British and we've got Canadian troops slogging it out. And now, John, this is where we get to the core of the matter. How does the 104th Infantry Division, the Timberwolves, get rolled into this? Because they're, as far as the map shows, they're the only guys in green, the only American troops that get kind of balled up along into it.
Yep. So British 21st Army Group is already borrowing two of our other divisions, the 82nd, 101st, to hold that corridor in Holland that we've liberated in our 90% successful operation or whatever. So they're going to basically borrow two more of our divisions, the 7th Armored, which doesn't fight in the core of the Scheldt, but fights in the Peel marshes to protect the eastern flank. And it's a mobile armor division. We're using it as a static formation to basically hold the flank. And then the 104th Infantry Division, which is going to have a major role right sort of in the heart of the Allied drive mainly from south to north, sort of from west to east, but a little bit of south to north. And so, but
moving all around the compass,
this way on our map, sort of. But they're right in the middle. They're right next to a Polish armor division too. So Poles are fighting there as well. They're fighting next to the British 49th Infantry Division and also some Canadians too. And the 104th, I should point out too, this is a unit that had been affected by Market Garden even before this, because they had gotten to Normandy around late summer, and they had been stripped of their trucking to support Market Garden. And so they'd been more or less immobilized until now, being fed into the line here. And what's interesting about them, this is a really well-trained reserve division. It comes from the reservist side of the Army. By now, you got all sorts of people, draftees and volunteers and ex-ASTPers and whatever else. But they're commanded by Terry Allen, who had commanded the 1st Infantry Division in the Mediterranean and is one of the finest division commanders in the U.S. Army, and is really, unique in the sense that he believes in night attacks, and that is not the culture of the U.S. Army at that time, I think, unfortunately. But
he's really pioneering training for night battles, even as early as 42.
Absolutely, big time. And I wish the rest of the Army would have picked up on that a bit more. So he's prepared them for any kind of fighting, so much as you can, any kind of fighting that they're going to experience in Europe, because he's been there, done that. and he wants them to be night fighters. Their nickname is the Timberwolves, and so they have that identity, of this kind of attack dog kind of identity. And it's a by the time it's fed in, I think it's October 25th, 1944. This is a really good, well-trained unit, fully equipped, fully staffed, ready to go in and fight. And of course, then, we all know what happens once the fighting begins. You're going to start losing people. So most of these guys, when they go in on this initial attack, they know one another. And that's a little bit different than some of the other Allied units that are getting kind of patched and quilted together. The Germans, too, even more so, obviously. But so it's basically plunge into the half water in the mud. Get any road you can, and watch out for the booby traps and the mines. You can imagine what an engineering problem this really is. It's just an awful experience from the first night.
And you've got the Germans in his 15th Army. What's the kind of composition? What's left? Because so much of German formations at this point are just fighting in kind of penny packets and being thrown together as fast as possible. What are they really running up against aside from the terrain and the weather?
So you've got on the German side, of course, 15th Army has siphoned some of its combat power to the east to deal with the western corridor of Market Garden. We've had that, but in the meantime, the Germans have successfully ferried tens of thousands of soldiers across these waterways. While we're doing the Market Garden thing, and some of our air power is absorbing that too. They have ferried a lot of these guys across the water. They have fortified, most notably like Walcheren Island and in many other places on our map here. So they really don't need a lot of manpower to do this, and they don't need particularly good quality fighting soldiers to do it either. If they
just need warm bodies with guns at some point.
So, a certain, like always, a certain number of them are Eastern Europeans or whatever. But really, in this case, in the Scheldt, it's primarily German manpower, not the cream of their army, of course, but they're good enough that they can man defensive positions. They have enough engineers that these fortifications are engineered and sited very well. The terrain does a lot of that for them too. They have artillery, which is another leveler. I mean, of course, we all understand how much their infantry and armor formations have been chewed up in Normandy and on the Eastern Front and all that too. But you know what? German artillery was still pretty darn good, and that was a bit of a leveling force. And that's one thing that I think is markedly different than the Pacific Asia theater, where the Japanese artillery-wise are completely outclassed.
Yeah,
the Germans at least have a modern professional artillery arm, if not on par with the Western Allies. It is proficient enough that it can do a tremendous amount of damage. And then mortars. It doesn't take that much to figure out how to make the mortars accurate, at least to some degree. And so they have enough people who are willing or able to do this, that these are tough objectives for us.
All I can imagine is fighting in like the Louisiana swamplands. I mean, they're not called the Low Countries for no reason. So I'm trying to, put my 21st century brain, into their combat boots, so to speak. And, getting anywhere in the Louisiana swamp is hellacious. So I can imagine, something that they're all experiencing. But John, kind of like when we talked about when it comes to Market Garden, this is obviously a joint Allied operation. Is there any sort of internal Allied bickering about what to do or what goals that we need to accomplish at the Scheldt?
The goal, believe it or not, Bo, there isn't a ton of bickering. I think your point, by the way, before I even address that, I want to build on your point about the swampland or whatever in Louisiana. That's just dead on. I mean, and it's funny, we were joking earlier about Sherman. It's the same thing he encountered around Vicksburg, right? I mean, so here we are in 1944. Of course, it's colder, and you don't have to worry about mosquitoes as much and all that. Like,
there's no alligators
or state birds,
right? There's no gators, So that's different than what the U.S. soldiers are dealing with in 1862 and 3. But you know what? Water's water, and mud is mud, and swamps are swamps, and trees are trees, and engineering problems are engineering problems. So it's really very similar in that regard, and also from a soldier's perspective, it's just miserable.
Yeah, I was going to say, and soldiers are soldiers, and they don't like to have wet feet, and they don't like to, it's hard to get somebody to march a mile and a half when the water's up to their knees, and they're just soaked the whole time.
in the mud, exactly. And
Yeah.
you're soaked. And of course, we have the trench foot problems and all that
Yeah.
that are, more akin to World War II than the Civil War. But it's still, and you're just, like you said, Joe, it's not fun to be marching a mile in this. It makes things heavier. It makes you feel heavier. It's depressing. It's cloudy. The days are getting shorter. It's just confining. Now, on the more plus side of the ledger, at the tactical level, these various allies get along pretty well. General Crocker, whose corps we're part of as the 104th Infantry Division, I think is a pretty solid commander on many levels. And so he's able to coordinate, I think, surprisingly well, divisions from 3 different countries in the Timberwolf sector I'm talking about. 104th, the 49th of the British Army, and then the Polish Armored Division 2. They're going to work fairly well together. But the one point of issue we've got a little bit is that the 104th is going to tend to advance quicker. So then you got the flank issue and all that. Now the Germans are never, and they're not really able to exploit that to the point where we might be concerned. But I think overall, I think it's amazing when you consider the challenges of coalition warfare that we work together as well as we do. And Alan has experienced this some in the Mediterranean theater, and so as earthy as he is and whatever, I do think that he's a pretty good team player, I think, in that respect. And I think he has coached his guys to be something of the same way. So, yeah, I mean, it's the challenge we have isn't necessarily the coordination among the allies. It's the terrain and the German opposition, which is at least enough to hold us up and inflict damage, I guess I would say, to cost us time.
And you've kind of we've mentioned him once and twice here and there, but Terry Allen, I think, is the figure that's worth spending a minute or two talking about, because he's one of the, when I read about him for the first time in Rick Atkinson's trilogy on the Army, you see him almost as like the perfect kind of example for the American soldier. Doesn't quite have it all figured out in 41 and 42, kind of learns as he goes and then perfects these methods throughout the war to the point where by the time we get to 1944 and by the time we get to the end of the war, we're a well-oiled fighting machine. And a lot of that comes down to men like Allen learning as they go. So talk a little bit about maybe some of his qualities and some of his personal leadership, maybe through the war and into this moment as well.
Yeah, Allen is definitely a consummate professional in the best sense of that word. What's unique about him compared with some of his divisional colleagues, he really doesn't care at all about getting his next promotion. He has no aspirations to be a corps commander or an army commander, to get his 3rd star. If it all happens, then great. But he doesn't care. What he cares about is you as a Timberwolf soldier. He cares about gaining ground, fulfilling his mission, just like he had in the Mediterranean with the Big Red One. He doesn't care. He still doesn't care about spit and polish. And
how do the men react to that? Because he's not cut off of the same cloth as a Patton, right?
Right. And sometimes they'll conflict with Patton, though they do have, pretty deep respect for each other in the end. And they're both cavalrymen in a way, but they do conflict because Patton is a bit more of that martinet. If you're not wearing your tie, I'll fine you $50. That kind of nonsense, in my opinion. But Allen doesn't care about that, and so the men react almost uniformly well to him. They some of them knew what he'd done in the Mediterranean, and so there's a little bit of comfort in that, of thinking this guy knows what he's doing. But I think it's fair to say, and so I'm basing this on just a ton of research into the 104th Division when I did September Hope, either interviewing people who were still around or obviously canvassing the sources, and also too sometimes getting secondhand from family members, sons and daughters who remembered what their father had said about Allen. I don't think I ever heard a negative word about him at all. It was almost like they had pride in him. And that usually means that's a good commander. They were proud he was their leader. They were proud to have that association with him. Many of them had an actual individual anecdotal experience with him. And the reason for that was he tended to really circulate around among the troops. So I think there was a great deal of confidence in him. When you look at the 104th and how it performs in this war, it's right up there. I mean, it's a terrific division. Eventually, they liberate a concentration camp at Nordhausen at the end, and that made a deep impression on these guys. You can imagine.
I was going to ask, how how did you come across them through writing on September Hope, or was it in connection with Hell Before Their Very Eyes as well?
Primarily September Hope, because in Hell Before Their Very Eyes, I didn't focus on Nordhausen. I thought about it because I'd known so many people who had that experience of liberating or witnessing Nordhausen. But no, it was really primarily September Hope because I was so determined to bring the Scheldt story to life, which I felt that was an integral part of Market Garden. I still do. I think the fact that very few people look at it that way is an example of the problem, in a way, of this kind of shaping the narrative, even all these decades later, around sort of putting the best face on what was, let's be honest, I mean, something of a disaster.
Yeah, and is that hesitance because we're just caught up with tanks and paratroopers?
Yeah, I think that's part of it, and that's all cool and it's fun, and
they made a movie about it.
Yeah, Bridge Too Far, which is awesome, of course, obviously, but yeah, and this is just the normal slog in World War II. What the Timberwolves deal with is pretty much what you would be part of as any other U.S. division fighting somewhere in the front in fall of 44, although obviously more water and swamp and whatever. But the point is, you're just involved in this attritional grinding campaign of let's gain 3 miles today, and so that's not as fun to talk about as airborne coup de main and tanks and all that kind of stuff, of course. So I get that. I have no problem with that. But I think but I've always hoped that this could be linked because to me, the 104th contributes something really quite important. That they are a major reason why the Allies are able to clear out the Scheldt and eventually get Antwerp operating later than we want, but still by mid-December. I don't know that this happens without the 104th playing a key role for the period of about 2 weeks or so in late October and November 1944 of advancing, over about a 25-mile operational area, maybe all the way to the Maas River. That's their role in this thing. And then once that's done, they're done with it, and they're going to be redeployed elsewhere. I think maybe the 9th Army, but I'm not sure. But they, they're not going to be staying with the 21st Army Group and Canadian First Army. It's a temporary thing for them.
John, you mentioned that we don't get Antwerp up and running as soon as we want. So that begs my question is, how soon do we want Antwerp? And I guess being hopeful, when does Allied Command want Antwerp up and working? And how long does this sort of, bloodbath at the Scheldt, how long does that, prevent the Allies from making that a reality?
Yeah, I mean, so the British capture Antwerp and the harbor facilities intact on September 4th, 1944. Now, that is an enormous get. You guys know that most of the time when we captured a harbor, the Germans would destroy it, most notably Cherbourg, most famously, right? This instance, we have captured, at no cost, the greatest harbor in Northern Europe. So how soon do we want that operation in operation? Like yesterday, but we also want this sort of pyrite out there of Market Garden. And so the problem is, as always, I mentioned, the terrain leading to Antwerp, we've got to have the Scheldt. And Montgomery's mistake, I think, is that he feels he can do both, that he can juggle both balls. So he can go to Market Garden and it won't really rob the Canadian First Army of momentum to get the Scheldt. And I think in that it's a big oversight because you're not accounting for those Germans in the 15th Army that I mentioned earlier, who they ferry into place. And so you're not closing the loop there. And like in wrestling terms, you're not pinning your opponent to the mat when you've got him there. And so this has always been my problem with Market Garden, of saying, okay, and even those who argue, and I respect their argument, that, it could have succeeded, we get a bridgehead over the Rhine, and okay, but for what purpose and at what cost, ultimately?
And what do you do once you're there? And how
exactly.
do you supply an army that's in the field once they're there?
Across this narrow corridor of Hell's Highway, as we famously call it, getting attacked on either flank with this accordion effect. I mean, so... Yeah, and what do you do once you're there? Are you going to Berlin? Is that what you're doing? And boy, believe you me, that's a big undertaking if we're really doing that. Are you outflanking the Siegfried line? Okay, maybe the Ruhr or whatever, but that's going to take a lot too. And so all of that
all of it goes against. We've talked about this 100 times, and you've mentioned this several times, not only in your book but in various interviews and presentations. It goes against the Allied kind of thinking. of a broad front strategy and against this sort of attritional war where all we're trying to do is put the tech and let the mechanized, arms of warfare handle it. Instead, we're just going to abandon that and charge hell for leather for Berlin and not have any supplies to sustain us once we're there, as though the Germans will just eventually collapse and we'll just walk right in and just take Berlin. It's okay. 1,000-year Reich, they just signed it over. Don't worry about it, guys.
Hitler will say, "Oh, the game's up. You got me, guys." Yeah.
Hitler, known for making incredibly logical, well-informed, totally sensical decisions, would completely have done that. Yes,
it's the ultimate taking the eye off the ball in that sense, and that's what I've said many times, that the whole thing is predicated on hope, and that hope is that the Germans are about to collapse, and that one more big knockout blow will take them down. Now, it would be one thing if that hope were based on some really good, solid intel. I'm saying, you get this bridge out over the Rhine, the Hitler regime will collapse, there will be an uprising, whatever. But it's another if it's just based on expectation or hope, and it's obviously, unfortunately, the latter. And I think that's the problem from the beginning. Honestly,
they almost stand as the perfect contrast, though, right? Because you're talking about Market Garden predicated on hope and all these things, and it's ambitious and it's pie in the sky, and it's using all of the might that an allied army can throw together at this point, airborne armor, all of it. And at the end of the day, it's just going to come down to an all-out slugfest, and the guys who are going to be fighting it are not the highly elite, super motivated paratroopers. It's the regular combat infantryman who, through most of the war, I think it's safe to say, is completely forgotten in favor of the paratroopers and the tank drivers. And it's almost as if we say, okay, well, it was Dick Winters and 10 guys that won World War II, the 82nd Airborne, the 1st Marine Division, the 8th Air Force. And then there's a long tail of all the guys who are in supply and logistics, who get the food where it's got to go and the ammunition where it's got to go. And then somewhere at the very end of all of that are the tank drivers. And then well below them are the infantrymen who have to actually fight this thing out. Talk about that for just a second. It's just the awesome contrast between it.
For sure. And I joke about that all the time, how it's amazing we beat Nazi Germany with one airborne company. Incredible. I mean, and all due respect to them, they're amazing, but they are
badasses. That's why Stephen Ambrose wrote about them.
Yeah, and it's cool. I mean, I again, respect them, knew many of them, and, so it's no aspersion on them. It's just silly, though, this fixation that continues this day. And so, I do think that the average poor bloody infantry gets lost in this. And to your earlier point, I totally admit I'm an unrepentant advocate of the broad front strategy, because it just makes all kinds of sense, especially from an American viewpoint. You use all your strengths here: manpower, firepower, financial power, all that, and maneuver power, yes, too. Air power, all of that is going to come into play. When you do this single thrust thing, to me, you play into Germany's hands, because then they can focus on that. And, that's a less ambitious kind of thing. And that's one of the reasons why Market Garden turns out the way it does. So we tried that single thrust, how'd that work out? And then we did the broad front later, eventually. And of course, we saw how that worked out in 1945. So, and who had to carry that out? Well, primarily a lot of infantry divisions populated by light infantrymen and mech infantrymen in armor divisions, who, by the way, were the majority of the combat power in most armor divisions. So that's how we had to fight the war. And I think to lose sight of that, you don't then really understand what World War II truly was. In the same way that in the Pacific, when it's like, oh, well, just a few Marines fought the Japanese. No,
right.
Again, the Marines are incredible, but there just aren't very many of them, and it's the Army that did the vast majority of fighting and everything else. So I think it's just unfortunate that maybe that narrative is taken home, but I guess I do understand, because it's easier, it's less depressing.
Yeah.
It's kind of upbeat and cool, like you said, to look at the badasses from Easy Company and whatnot. So I totally sympathize, but I also think it's too bad, because it leads to a misunderstanding of the war on some level, at least.
Well, it makes you kind of wonder, I think, because a lot of airborne operations, airborne soldiers, at least in the grand scheme of, historical warfare, is a relatively new concept.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it still has such a level of newness, that even, 40, 50, 60, even 100 years later, I think we're still going to be obsessed with the airborne, because in comparison, infantry has been around since, the days of Adam. I was making a joke because I'm teaching a Western civilization course, and I'm talking about the development of the ancient Greeks and this whole operation where they kind of transform their military operations to, start to collectively more fight together. And I talk about the hoplite revolution and how hoplites are these, armed foot soldiers, and they're typically armed with a 10, 11, 12-foot spear and a short thrusting sword for more hand-to-hand close combat. And I'm like, think of the guy, that came up with the idea of having the type of weapon that is a spear. It's like, I want to stab you, but like from 10 feet away.
Right.
And then I said, and okay, now think about the guy who made archery. It's like, I want to stab you, but from really far away, And then we've just become increasingly better at finding ways to stab people from longer and longer distances.
Exactly.
Seemingly has been,
we fight with missiles.
Flight.
Bullets or missiles, exactly.
Exactly.
Just arrows were in the old days. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I'm not saying it's wrong.
We always look for the newest, nicest, most effective way of killing, but at the end of the day, it's a guy who, never in a million years imagined himself being drafted or going off to fight, and he shows up in a place like the Scheldt estuary, soaked to his waist, being rained on, miserable. The rations are there, but they're not great. And he's fighting against an enemy that is entrenched and is using the environment against him.
Mm-hmm.
And his weapon is an M1 Garand or a BAR or whatever. And he has the reliance, though, on the Allies' kind of way of war, which is artillery and air power and all these things. But at some point, it is just down to that man and to men like him that have to fight this thing out. And that is the one thing I have always enjoyed, and I'm going to sound like I'm fangirling here, but John, I mean it. When I read your books, I get a better appreciation for the fighting man, because it really is, they come from, when you look at some of the African-American units, they come from various racial backgrounds. You look at some of the white units, they come from various ethnic and economic backgrounds. Region has a lot to do with it, but it really is the American army that fights in the Second World War is the best representation of us as a country. But they're the ones that have to go and do this, and it's not easy. It's not worth writing a movie about. They're not going to get a lot of star-studded attention because it just sucks.
Yep.
It is just awful for them.
It's the worst.
Through the duration.
It's a great point, Joe, and that's actually what drew me to this in the first place. This whole thing of studying military history, and obviously the U.S. in World War II, or at any point in its military history, is the human story. Who are these folks? Why do they do this? What is this like for them? How does this affect them? How do their actions affect the larger forces of history, and vice versa? And that's what really draws me to this. And so when I was a kid reading a lot of World War II, it just seemed like a lot of books were quite antiseptic. And I just wondered, as we're talking about this unit going there and this commander doing this, or whatever, I wonder what was that like for the soldiers? Where were they? Who were they? What was this? What was actually happening there? And so I've always tried to drill down as deep as possible into that, and no more so than in this chapter I did on the Scheldt, which I had tons of great sources, fortunately, to give you a sense of like, okay, here's what they're up against. Here's who they are. And like you said, it absolutely sucks. So just imagine your worst day and just, a situation where you'd rather be anywhere else and you can't be. And it's just a matter of the three of us and who the other 9 people who populate our squad going and doing what's expected of us today. And who knows how many of us are left tomorrow. and having to deal with that morale wise, and then the conditions. And so the typical pace of combat is, as I mentioned, advancing, whatever is your objective, and usually with a lot of artillery support, fortunately, but it better be well coordinated. And it usually is. It generally is. They do a really nice job. And so that's probably capturing dikes and embankments, watching out for roadblocks. This is a big engineering problem too, because engineers are having to deal with the mines that are not just in the roadblocks, but also sometimes in any route of advance or any road or whatever. And so they may be out in front of the infantry, depending, but there's a lot of casualties to mines and booby traps. A lot of thus then, unfortunately, a lot of amputations that the medical people have to do quite under duress. And they're another element of this whole thing too, in terms of just this whole thing sucking and having to deal with the human dimension of this. And then, like water crossings. So dragging boats, if you can imagine the physical arduousness of that, dragging boats, usually in the dark, maybe for about a mile under this polder land and in the wet and the mud, which is tough to get your footing, and then get on that boat and hope to get across, and then for engineers to build a bridge behind you to resupply. There's one instance where they send across a battalion in the 415th Infantry, I think, because the Allies want to be advancing very quickly. General Crocker wants a quick advance for obvious reasons. But we're just not ready yet. And these guys get cut off and they get penned in, and they basically get annihilated for the most part. And this is just one sort of little forgotten thing that is like the biggest deal ever to the 700 people who were in that battalion, and really the division writ large, that ends up as a kind of footnote or whatever, but is something that can happen in the context of this order. So certainly it's a big victory for the Allies, I guess, and that the Germans are in a bad situation and they lose and all that, but still look at the cost of this. It's I
was going to ask is we kind of, as we sort of wrap things up, is do you think, looking back, at any point in time, Allied war planners realized, we shouldn't have punted for Market Garden, should have just put all of our effort in it at capturing Antwerp, taking the Scheldt, and continued on the broad front, and almost just make Market Garden become the footnote then, and let this be the main effort? Because it does seem as though, even though we dedicated an entire week of time to Market Garden, we all walked away saying the same thing. It was worth it. It was worth a shot. You never know what might have happened. But then you think about the fighting that had to go on essentially to recoup the loss of Market Garden. But we haven't even talked about the fact that the Germans are going to knock out all the dikes. They're going to flood the farmland. They're going to starve the Dutch civilian population. And so if you aren't lucky enough to have been in the liberated cities of Eindhoven or Nijmegen, if you're north of there, you are in for the worst 6 months of your life until the war does come to an end. And the other piece of it is, Chowhound comes along. So we have to do all this work essentially to make up for Market Garden. Is there at any point in time when you were sitting back going, they should have just never tried it? It was not worth it, not with all of this other punishment that comes along with it.
Oh, I've said that from the beginning. I am definitely an opponent of Market Garden. I made that very, very clear over the years. I think, though understandable and impressive in the planning, and implementation, and of course the fighting off the charts, but it was absolutely misbegotten. It was based on hope. It was absolutely foolish and really a devastating thing. And I have laid that at Eisenhower's feet, who I think was a great commander, but I think this is his worst decision. And it grows out of a lot of problems that were, accumulating in the late summer 1944. Him being distant from the battlefields, his need issues, the communication problems, the issues with Montgomery personally, the stress within the coalition on many levels, and the V2 coming into play too, some of which are getting launched from the Netherlands or whatever, and the Dutch resistance wanting to rise up. I mean, of course, there's all these other factors, but in the end, I think it was a disastrous decision. I'm not, by the way, saying that if he doesn't make that decision, he goes for Antwerp, everything is going to be hunky-dory and we'll end the war in 44. I don't know that we would have.
Because the Germans still get to react.
They get to react.
Either you're going to fight them at Market Garden, or you're going to fight them in the Scheldt estuary, or fight them in Antwerp, or you're going to continue to fight them across whatever, a 200-mile or 300-mile front. You're still going to deal with them somewhere.
You are, and they've proven themselves really resilient in this war. And you know, the Soviets are having logistical issues on the Eastern Front, obviously. But I think, though, all that said, we would have been in a much better position in the fall of 1944, and we would have inflicted a lot more damage upon the Germans. And it's possible then the Battle of the Bulge doesn't happen, because we're degrading them maybe with some of those formations that are thrown into the maw, because we're putting pressure on them with the broad front. And that's speculative. But what isn't speculative is that Hitler reacts to Market Garden by planning the Bulge. Okay, so we know that as a fact. But you know, Joe, you wondered, is there any point where, you know, whoever that ubiquitous the high command or whatever realizes how misbegotten this is and whatever. I think Eisenhower realizes this far too late, probably by the end of September and in October, when he finally tells Montgomery, after sending so many mixed signals, nothing I've said before, nothing I said thereafter will distract from the importance of Antwerp. You know, getting that and opening up and all that. And it's like, okay, now we know we have to prioritize the Scheldt. And so that's why we end up feeding in combat power there, you know, in the campaign we were just talking about, which the Timberwolves are part. So that's a classic, you know, closing the barn after the horses escape, the barn door after the horses escape, right? I mean, but it's better late than never. But it's really, I think, quite tragic in the consequences it has for the Dutch. The hunger, winter, and all the rest. But are they going to be better off if we never come to the Netherlands in the first place?
Right.
No. But if we have a broad front advance in which we can feed and sustain 21st Army Group a little bit better, I don't know. Maybe that's going to be better for some of the Dutch, and we'll liberate maybe more of it. Who knows? But what we do know is Market Garden is a fail. I'm sorry. It just is. If anybody gets angry with me, I apologize to you. If you have to,
I'll send you the comments. Don't worry.
Send me the comments. They can beat me up over that. But I'd invite them to tell me exactly how it does succeed in terms of what they wanted to do. Maybe I've missed that part where we got to Berlin or something, but I don't think so. I mean, it's just.
John, that was the conclusion of the book. You just have to skip all of the hard fought stuff, jump from September the 17th to the 26th, and then go right to April 1945.
Then we get to Berlin, and then it ended somehow. Yeah, but I do respect that the Dutch point of view can be different, especially like in the Nijmegen, Eindhoven area and whatnot. But that's liberation, and that matters a lot. And it's so I greatly respect that, but I'd also point out it's at the price of your homes becoming a battleground too, and we can't look past the destruction that means for people's homes and people being uprooted, civilians being killed, the Dutch resistance and their valor, how many people they lose in this fight, so everyone pays a price for this, and on some level, I guess.
Hey,
so
Bo,
John, what have you come across? Either from research in the 104th Infantry Division or just overall the Battle of the Scheldt. What's something that you've come across that people have kind of taken out of proportion or have taken to misrepresent the battle? What's some boohickey behind all of this?
In the Scheldt or in Market Garden as a whole? Because Market Garden has some
A bunch of it.
Let's just stick to the Scheldt. We did a whole week of Market
Garden.
I mean, Scheldt, I think if there's boohickey, it's that we could take it with an understrength Canadian First Army that's dealing with a lot of other issues at that point. And what I mean by that is certainly the mobile campaign that everybody is stressed logistically, but also that they're besieging the channel ports, and that takes manpower. So I think this is really misbegotten that the Scheldt is going to be this kind of easy thing to pluck away, that you can use an understrength formation to take it. I mean, I think Montgomery really finds this out the hard way, because remember, I mean, Canadian First Army comes under his control. It's his, and so he's assigned what he thinks of as a backbench kind of mission, and that doesn't work out well at all. The other thing I'd point out too is that not for the Americans, but for our allies, there are amphibious operations involved in this campaign too. the taking a Welcher in Ireland, for instance, which is absolutely no picnic. So it's interesting. That's, I guess, maybe the last Western Allied invasion in the war in Europe, because it's post Dragoon, obviously post Normandy. So I think it's interesting on that level too. If you're interested in the whole naval mine side of the war and naval demining operations, this is really a major mission for the Royal Navy, and that I think they perform magnificently, in my opinion, just to get those waters open and get Antwerp in operation by mid-December. It's just a hell of a lot of professionalism and know-how, I think, to do this whole job from the ground to the waters.
Can you even imagine not having access to Antwerp by the time we were embroiled in Battle of the Bulge, trying to get supplies, still bringing it in from Normandy or flying it in and not being able to? No. Okay.
No.
It would have been a serious problem. You would not have been able to reinforce and react the way that Eisenhower does. And even that's with Antwerp being new in the ledger. And also, I'd add, too, not having Marseille and Toulon in the ledger, which that's really, to some extent, one of the best strategic byproducts of Operation Anvil Dragoon, is that we've got that, and that'll sustain, the better part of Patch's 7th Army and the French 1st Army, if not more. So yeah, I mean, we don't have any of that, and of course there's plenty of folks who don't want us to invade South France, and so what's that going to mean, logistically? And then of course, obviously, as we've gone round and round with Market Garden and Antwerp, so track these from the ledger, you're just not going to be able to operate.
Well, Bo, that was your boohickey. So now we have the good old what's in your cup. You're going to work. So you better not have anything too feisty in the cup.
So for me, this is my opportunity to tell our listeners to hydrate, drink responsibly. Unfortunately, my drink of the day has been H2O because, I'm trying not to get too sloshed before I go to work.
That's fair. John?
Always a mistake. You should get totally sloshed. No. just water in my cup too.
Yeah, it's not vodka. I promise.
Absolutely.
I'm at least going to be fun, and I don't have it in my cup yet, but I'm on my way to go get it right now as we drive some 50 minutes to the grocery store in Smyrna. But I'm going to go pick up a favorite British soda, Tango, and that will be in my cup very, very soon.
Sooner than later.
Terrific.
They have a green apple one that's at the store. It's
apparently American Fanta sucks.
American Fanta does suck compared to British Fanta. There, I said it. It's not even a contest. But since we've plugged 2 other corporations, we may as well plug our sponsors, Civil War Trails, the world's largest outdoor museum. Get out there, make some history of your own. And if you are out there and you do take a picture with a sign, use the hashtag #SignSelfie and help other people learn about Civil War Trails and their program, which takes you across 6 of the most battle-tested states of the American Civil War. For more information, visit the link down in the show notes or in the description, and we'll see you out on the trail. John, this has been great. I think this is a great way to kind of tag on one more episode to the Market Garden series. Is like, we talked for a week about airborne. Sorry, we should have paid more attention. Like Allied warplanners to Scheldt.
Just like Ike, better late than never.
Yeah.
That's right.
Bo, any final things? Nothing?
I think this is the fastest I think we've ever had a repeat guest on Homebrew.
Yeah.
So we don't have any like medals, but if we did, I'm pinning it to you now.
Here you go, John. We'll give you
that with pride. I appreciate that, Bo.
I have a Lipscomb University College of Business challenge coin. There, it's yours.
It's yours.
My day is made. Thank you.
Digitally given. Let's take it out. Cheers, guys.
Cheers, everybody.
Yeah. See ya.